Welcome back. In the first episode of Aleister Crowley Was a Hypnotist, we covered Crowley being either described as a hypnotist or having performed hypnotism. We saw Charlotte Chabrier's article describing Crowley doing a hypnosis demonstration on a group of ladies in her home. We saw depictions of Crowley in fiction as one with great hypnotic power. We heard from a contemporary fellow occult author who described Crowley's incredible hypnotic ability and detailed an evening where Crowley tried to hypnotize him against his will. As something we will touch upon today, we recalled Crowley having a profound realization on Rite while holding the book Magnetism by hypnotist Baron Du Potet, which was a gift from his friend John Yarker, who happened to be the one who introduced Crowley to Freemasonry and thus the OTO. We looked at how Yarker and hypnotist Papist granted Theodore Royce the permission for the rituals which the OTO would employ in its formation, the organization which Crowley would use to establish his system of Thelema. We looked at how Papist got his name from a work translated by Levi, and we dipped our toes into some of Levi's fascination with magnetism or hypnotism. On that, we brought up how Crowley claimed to be Eliphas Levi's reincarnation, and how he translated Levi's The Key of the Mysteries, and how he presented it to the Golden Dawn to demonstrate his understanding of the highest level of their order. So Aleister Crowley was a hypnotist, we get it. Yet that just set the stage for the discussion we can now have as we dive deeper in parts 2 and 3. Now you might be wondering what is on screen. Well, in the past when I would raise that Crowley was a hypnotist, it seemed rather plain and obvious to me, yet I would be told by those who say there's no way, and this was the proof that was in their pocket, the oath which Crowley brought into the OTO from the Golden Dawn. The neophytes would make an oath that they will not suffer themselves to be hypnotized or mesmerized, nor will they place themselves in any such passive state that any uninitiated person, power, or being may cause them to lose their control of their thoughts, words, or actions. We should note that it says any person, power, or being, as this is talking about a wider understanding than a practical level of a person identifying as a hypnotist, or one in the role of a hypnotist. We will refute this actually in part 3, where we base an episode around Crowley's secretary and disciple Israel Regardie. We have a whole lot of hypnotic material to get to before we get there in part 2, so let's dive in. One of the most important and impactful figures in Crowley's circle was Charles Stansfeld Jones, also known as Parzival the Fool, and most commonly as Frater Achad, which is the name he would choose to publish his written works under, the name being borrowed from the Hebrew word of unity or one. Achad was also known as OIV-VIO, and is mirrored VIO-OIV, which stands for one in all in one, one in all, unus in omnibus, omnibus in unus. Crowley considered Achad his magical son, who is prophesied in the Book of the Law, a position he would rightfully earn by revealing hidden keys in the text, altering the trajectory of Crowley and his work. Without Jones, Crowley has a lesser foundation for his non-dual tradition. Crowley's Book of the Law, thanks to Achad, is known as Liber Al, where Al, or El, God, and La, being not, are mirrored. Achad provided this key in a text called Liber 31, which is a part of the diary of Frater OIV-VIO concerning the fool Parzival and how he discovered the mystery of the one that is not. Frater Achad wrote a few books, my favorite of which is 31 Hymns to the Star Goddess Who Is Not. He also wrote QBL, The Egyptian Revival, Crystal Vision Through Crystal Gazing, and perhaps most famously, a little booklet called The Chalice of Ecstasy, which was a Kabbalistic interpretation of Wagner's Parzival. Parzival is a story about the Holy Grail, enlightenment, which is framed around this religious ecstasy, which is not the lowly worldly ecstasy. The word ecstasy is derived from Greek ekstasis, which implies trance, and in context of this work, Achad provides Crowley's words, where he says the East uses meditation as a best path to achieve this state, whereas in the West he felt the best way to achieve it was ritual ceremony. Crowley wrote, "In ritual, therefore, we seek continually to unite the mind to some pure idea by an act of will. This we do again and again, more and more passionately, with more and more determination, until at last the mind accepts the domination of the will and rushes of its own accord toward the desired object. This surrender of the mind to its Lord gives the holy ecstasy we seek." The Chalice of Ecstasy provides some detail about Wagner's ritual performance of Parzival, which is intended on producing a result in the mind of its audience. Quoting Frater Achad, "Unless the play is properly staged, and the parts taken by those who themselves understand at least something of the way of holiness, this effect is not made upon the consciousness of the onlookers. This is doubtless one of the reasons why Wagner made arrangements that this work should only be produced at Bayreuth, in a proper setting and under right conditions, for it represents the summit of his magical mountain, of which the base was the ring. He called it a stage-consecrating festival, and its effects were intended to exert their influence upon the drama of life itself." Famed author Leo Tolstoy had made a remark upon this in What is Art, where he wrote, "People say you cannot judge without having seen Wagner performed at Bayreuth, in the dark, where the orchestra is out of sight, concealed under the stage, and where the performance is brought to the highest perfection, and this just proves that we have here no question of art, but one of hypnotism." Nietzsche, who had been designated by Crowley as a thelemic saint, had stated in the case of Wagner that Wagner was a hypnotist, a magnetizer, and one who had hypnotic grip over his audience, writing on Wagner's success that his success with the nerves and consequently with women has turned the entire ambitious musical world into disciples of his secret art. And if Wagner was accused of hypnotism, then he was hardly the first. The secret art was around before Wagner, and was popularized perhaps by Mesmer, who used robes and wands in the theatrics of his healing rituals, where music too had a presence. Instruments such as the glass harmonica were played out of sight during the treatments. Mesmer regarded animal magnetism as a matter of sympathetic vibration, which could be communicated, propagated, and reinforced by sound. It was even argued by some after Mesmer that most of the success he had found with his experimentation and sessions were due to the influence of the music. In 1914, the New York World paper ran an article titled "Master Magician Reveals Weird Supernatural Rites," where they spoke of the many facets of Crowley, writing to one actor that they only knew Crowley as a theatrical producer and as the designer of extraordinary stage costumes. This highlights what Crowley had crafted in his public performances. Take, for example, the Rites of Ulysses, which he stated the productions were done with the intention of bringing about the state of ecstasy in the audience. The controversial Looking Glass paper in October of 1910 wrote about one such performance, describing where the Mother of Heaven, Leila Weidel, played her violin masterfully while the room was plunged in complete darkness. The playing was succeeded with a loud hammering, where then robed figures took to the stage to wake the seven sleepers, and a flame was shown through a trap door before the room was plunged in darkness again. These performances featured chanting, the reciting of poetry, commanding voices hidden behind curtains, moments of dervish dancing, and more. Achad's The Chalice of Ecstasy is peppered with Crowley's excerpts and verses, which Achad uses to illustrate this transcendental religious ecstasy, which is arrived at through divine love, such as from Liber 4. For each individual thing, attainment means first and foremost the destruction of the individuality. Each of our ideas must be made to give up the self to the beloved, so that we may eventually give up the self to the beloved in our turn. We could speak endlessly about ecstasy, trance, and magnetism and go on many tangents. See, for example, The History of Magic, Witchcraft, and Animal Magnetism by John Campbell Calhoun, to trace the evolution of this religious ecstasy from Egypt to the 1800s when that work was published. I may also do future videos on the 3 volumes produced by Scandinavian University Books by Ernst Ardman titled Ecstasy or Religious Trance. For this we can go on all day, so let us proceed to explore more explicit hypnosis links with Crowley and Achad. One day, at Crowley's suggestion, Achad read a book which was published in English in 1921 titled Suggestion and Autosuggestion, which is a work about hypnotism by Charles Baudouin. The full title is Suggestion and Autosuggestion, a psychological and pedagogical study based upon the investigations made by the New Nancy School. For context, the New Nancy School and the Paris School were 2 rival schools of hypnosis in the late 19th and early 20th centuries France. The Nancy School, founded by Ambrose Auguste Liébault and Hippolyte Bernheim, argued that hypnosis was a normal phenomenon of suggestion that could be induced in anyone by appropriate stimuli, whereas the Paris school, led by Jean-Martin Charcot, argued that hypnosis was a pathological state of dissociation that only occurred in hysterical patients. Charles Baudouin wrote that Emile Coue represented a second Nancy school and had written his book Suggestion and Autosuggestion in dedication to him. This work contained chapters on subjects such as the law of reversed effect, auto-hypnosis, Coue's practice, suggestion in the education of children, and suggestion and the will. This work ends with the paragraph, "The work of modern science is a great achievement, but is still incomplete. For its completion, a certain change is necessary both in outlook and method. As the philosopher Spur has put it, we are masters of nature externally alone. Inwardly, we are nature's slaves. Studying only too well all that surrounds us, we have forgotten our own personality, and now or never is the moment when we must put into practice the Socratic maxim, know thyself. The doctrine of the New Nancy School, in conjunction with other doctrines of contemporary psychology, enables us to make a great advance in this knowledge." It was after reading this book that Achad was inspired to study the work of Emile Coue himself. Eventually, this would lead to the inspiration of merging the work of Coue and Crowley. Emile Coue was a French psychologist many consider to be the father of modern self-hypnosis, having popularized the concept of autosuggestion, where autos in Greek means self, so self-suggestion. Coue instructed his patients to take a string with about 30 knots tied into it. With the string in their hands, the patients would run it through their fingers as if counting each knot, but instead of counting, they would say or gabble to themselves his famous dictum, "Tout le jeu dépend de vous, je vais de mieux mieux." Thanks to a gramophone recording from 1923, we can hear him recite this mantra. The translation into English that he found most satisfactory was, "Day by day, in every way, I'm getting better and better."
Tous les jours, à tout point de vue, je vais de mieux en mieux. Tous les jours, à tout point de vue, je vais de mieux en mieux. Tous les jours, à tout point de vue, je vais de mieux en mieux, etc. Comme si l'on récitait les litanies. Par la répétition, vous faites pénétrer mécaniquement dans votre inconscient par l'oreille la phrase qui est inusée. Tous les jours, à tout point de vue, je vais de mieux en mieux.
Coue said that autosuggestion is a double-edged sword and emphasized our personal responsibility. When used well, it can work wonders, but when used poorly, it can be disastrous. He notes that suggestion doesn't have to be so blatant, that it's possible to make suggestions to people without their knowledge and without any preparation. For instance, a doctor who by their title alone has a suggestive influence on their patient. Coue said that before he had elaborated on the subject in his book, My Method, autosuggestion was an unconscious force, and it was a force that was used to give us bad suggestions. Knowing this, he said we must use it for good. This statement sounding eerily close to one made by Aleister Crowley in his extolling the practice of magic. To paraphrase him, the reason for practicing magic is that we are already doing it. So, knowing that, we should do it well rather than poorly. Oh, and before we move on, it's worth pointing out that Coue's method has been said to be 93% effective. Crowley was obviously familiar not only with Charles Baudouin, since he recommended the book to align more closely with his magical child, but he was evidently also familiar with Emile Coue. In Crowley's diaries from the period of 1923, we find Crowley referring to Coue oddly enough as Uncle Coue, a name many Thelemites affectionately have given Aleister Crowley or Uncle Al. You can put your guesses as to why in the comment section. In those diaries, we can also find Crowley meditating with sincerity on some of Coue's writings. It should be noted that Crowley brings up Mary Eddy along with Coue in one of the diary entries. Mary Eddy was the founder of what is called Christian Science. If interested in exploring, there are a number of books on the subject, such as Mesmerism and Christian Science, A Short History of Mental Healing by Frank Podmore, though Eddy tried to separate Christian Science from mesmerism by saying that rather than any mesmeric fluid or astral fluid from another, one is a vehicle for the Spirit of God, which enables this power to heal as Christ did. Eddy's view of magnetism seemed to be all-encompassing, where man's evil and the evil of the world was a power stripped from the devil, and was instead something she coined MAM, or malicious animal magnetism. Eddy would become paranoid about the powers of MAM, and would expel people from her circle who she felt were using mesmerism maliciously against her, even feeling that her husband was assassinated at a distance in this way. Let's return to our friend Frater Achad and his inspiration after reading the work of Emile Coue. Achad came up with an idea he called psychomagia, which was a further development of the Coue system, with other influences that would bring together psychology, psychoanalysis, and magic. Crowley was the second member of the Psychomagian Society, which abided by a very thelemic manifesto. The manifesto stated, "Man is at present ignorant of the nature and powers of his own being. It is necessary to discover who one is, what one is, and why one is, in order that we may fulfill our true will and purpose in life in an intelligent manner. Every individual is essentially sufficient to themselves, but they are unsatisfactory to themselves until they have established themselves in right relation with the universe. Psychomagia combines the essential features of psychology and psychoanalysis with magic, which is the science and art of causing change to occur in conformity with will. Members would carry business cards, and the whole organization was focused on self-volition and self-initiation. You would ideally sign the membership card in the presence of another, but this was not necessary." And it seems that Achad also didn't find it necessary to devote himself to seek an editor. Everyone unconsciously believes in things and theories, principles, and compromises which they cannot justify with their own intelligence, but which they accept because other people accept them. Through constant repetition, all the functions of the brain are reduced to automatism. Louis Sato says that this is the key to understanding suggestion. Everyone is inclined within certain limits to accept the statements of another without the opportunity to test them at length, and often without being able to test them at all. The human mind is most easily influenced in early youth. Children simply accept the statements, assertions, and judgments of their elders without being able to verify their accuracy. These leave an impression on them, take possession of their minds, and often become deeply and firmly rooted in their subconscious. Many adults who earnestly strive to build up their lives by means of observation and critical judgment cannot explain to themselves where those prejudices really come from, which they find so difficult to fight. They are the remnants of statements implanted in their minds by suggestion in childhood. The elements of the spiritual life and also the mental development of humans are, unfortunately, often no more than an endless chain of suggestions. And it's not just children, as Crowley's introduction to the Book of the Law stated, "At this current time, even as adults, we are children." In part 1 of this series, we mentioned the hypnotist occultist Papus. He was of the view that hypnotism was a self-directed force against the animal or impulse body in man, commanded by will. Eliphas Levi shared this view, stating that the spirit element directing and controlling the 4 elements of form was the essence of the transcendental art of magic, that the astral light has a direct effect upon our nerves, and that the astral light is the physical soul of the 4 elements, and that the empire of will over the astral light is symbolized in magic by the symbol of the pentagram. The man who introduced the word gas into scientific literature, John Baptist Van Helmont, said that we should not tremble at the name magia, which was translated as magic with a K in the 1922 publication Johann Baptist Van Helmont, alchemist, physician, and philosopher. Magic was, well, it was magnetism. Van Helmont acknowledged that magic could be used for good or ill intent, that such power can be used or abused. However, he insisted that the power, being magnetism, is not a force of Satan, but rather it is the power of that which is not of Satan. That magnetism is a co-natural power inherent in man, and it lies dormant until it is stirred up. He writes that if one is to employ the art of the Qabalah, that they can cause excitement and stir up this power, and that to do so is a great pleasure. It is the ability to do this, Van Helmont says, that makes one an adeptus or obtainer, whose governor is the Spirit of God. And as you may recall, in our last episode we explored Eliphas Levi speaking of magnetism and magic.
Levi also spoke of the church and how the church utilizes magnetism as one of its chief powers, which is why it must condemn magic.
The Holy See and Pope Pius IX, in the Sacred Congregation of the Holy Office on the 28th of July 1847, would help remove some of the taboo from hypnosis, by offering the following decree. Having removed all misconceptions, foretelling of the future, explicit or implicit invocations of the devil, the use of animal magnetism is indeed merely an act making use of physical media that are otherwise licit, and hence it is not morally forbidden, provided that it does not tend towards an illicit end or towards anything depraved. Now, let's retrace our steps from a few moments ago, where John Baptist Van Helmont wrote that it was by the art of the Qabalah that one can stir up this magical power of magnetism. Qabalah's roots have been linked to hypnotism by many. For example, the work of Rabbi psychologist Samuel Glasner and Dr. Margareta Bowers, titled Auto-Hypnotic Aspects of the Jewish Kabbalistic Concept of Kavanah, compares the Jewish Kabbalistic state of Kavanah with auto-hypnosis. In Jewish theology, ritual or prayer success is entirely dependent on achieving Kavanah, which implies concentration and correct intention, as Kavanah literally means intention or sincere feeling direction of the heart. Kavanah was used to induce a state of religious ecstasy and the state of deeper understanding and experiencing God in inner reality. Talmudic scholars note that Kavanah was used to produce depersonalization so that the prophets could see themselves elsewhere. Ancient Jewish philosopher Maimonides said that any prayer without Kavanah was no prayer at all. Bowers and Glasner were specifically impressed by the auto-hypnotic nature of methods employed by the Kabbalistic philosopher and mystic Abraham Abulafia, one of the earliest Kabbalists who died in the year 1291. His system was called Prophetic Qabalah, and it had the ultimate goal of obtaining community with God. The resulting hypnotic fantasies of his work offered new insights and truths by his concentrating upon the magical properties of the Hebrew letters, starting with Tetragrammaton, Yod-He-Vav-He, and arranging the letters to develop 99 further names of God. To generate these names, he employed several practices, such as gematria. Gematria being one of Aleister Crowley's lifelong fascinations, which Achad found equally infectious. Both would write at length on Qabalah and employing gematria. Leo Tolstoy, who we mentioned earlier, wrote that hypnotic influence could be caused by the arts and by forms of media in print, for example newspapers and books. He posited that hypnotic influence was put in use in places where you'd find authority in dress or uniform, such as educational institutions or the church. He postulated in his journal that an 80% majority are hypnotized by scientific, artistic, political, or religious hypnosis, and thus they don't use their faculty of reason. Frater Achad wrote a little book called Crystal Vision Through Crystal Gazing, and in this work he referenced receiving a letter from Crowley. And he writes how a writer's magnetism may be sufficient to produce a symbolic vision of the nature sometimes seen in crystals. Now, crystal vision is a metaphor and a device or a tool. Achad's book calls the crystal the lesser crystalline sphere, whereas the greater crystalline sphere is the body itself. One learns to take themselves into trance and to produce visions using a tool such as a crystal or a magic mirror to tap into the astral fluid and its images, which they are always capable of receiving without the aid of the device, but perhaps just requiring a technique or prompt to receive. As we can recall, Achad had read a few books on or about hypnotism, but in his book Crystal Vision, he is writing on the subject himself. In this work, Achad leans several times upon a book by author John Melville by directly providing passages from it, stating the instructions are solid and it would be useless to reinvent the wheel. Melville's book quoted by Achad just so happens to also applaud Baron Du Potet and his dedication to the science of magnetism, and how Baron Du Potet tried to restore this science to its appropriate name of Magick. Which, if you recall, in part 1 of the series, we saw that Crowley understood ritual while holding Du Potet's book, and we saw too that Levi wrote at length on Du Potet in the history of magic. Anyways, John Melville's work emphasized the importance of the type of crystal, which perhaps was important long ago to classic crystal scryers, but in Crystal Vision Through Crystal Gazing, Achad handles the modern approach to crystal gazing with levity and charm. In one chapter, he sends the reader out on a quest to go to a shop where they are to follow their intuition on choosing a crystal that calls out to them. And he warns them not to buy one egregiously priced compared to what they can afford, as to not taint all future sessions with that crystal, where a regret would surface in association with seeing the object. He details how to concentrate, magnetize, and store the crystal, but then in the next chapter admits how the modern one purchased is likely not a crystal at all, but may be synthetic or made of glass. However, the crystal was never the important part. It is but a metaphor, as well as a practical tool. It is used for taking oneself into trance. Achad also writes that loving the crystal is important, how love is the tendency of any two things becoming one, thus losing themselves in a third idea, different from either of them. In this samadhi trance, the seer and the seen become one object. Then is there the marriage that brings upon this non-dual state, which is golden. Levi's work, which revealed the meanings of many magic symbols, such as explaining that the caduceus is two serpents intertwined about a staff, represent the secret of magnetism. The right-hand serpent is Ode, which represents the magnetism controlled by the will of the operator. The left-hand serpent is Ob, and represents the magnetism of passive clairvoyance. At the top of the hermetic staff shines the golden globe, which represents the hour, the light in equilibrium. The symbol of the caduceus is famously found emanating from the lap of the Baphomet, which represents Levi's equilibrium of the opposites essential to his magnetism. The importance of this symbol being brought up is that Aleister Crowley would take Baphomet as one of his magical names. Recall in episode 1, where we repeated Eliphas Levi's line which said that true love is the nature of magnetism. Magnetism and love are closely linked. Pierre Janet, who studied under Jean-Martin Charcot in the Paris School of Hypnotism, discussed a certain somnambulistic passion which patients would have towards their hypnotist, calling it a very special form of love. Mesmer would call this rapport, and Sigmund Freud would associate this to transference. We mentioned with the Psychomagian Society that Achad wanted to blend psychoanalysis and magic. Psychoanalysis stands on the shoulders of hypnosis, and hypnosis is only distance as Freud was generally poor at it, having little success with the practical application of hypnosis on others. Jung would have great success with hypnosis, and would do frequent demonstrations by taking a weak-bodied individual and placing their head on one chair and their ankles on another, and leave them suspended for a great duration after telling them that they are stiff as a board, and then would have athletic volunteers come up to volunteer to repeat this feat. Of course, they would not be able to. Sandor Ferenczi, a close associate of Freud, considered hypnosis as a form of transference relationship and had made the distinction of paternal and maternal hypnosis. Paternal hypnosis would be a trance induced by fear, with maternal hypnosis being induced by love, supposing in hypnosis that one is surrendering to the hypnotist in some degree, or is renouncing control, placing a sense of security in another's hands. As an example of paternal hypnosis, think of soldiers, who have higher rates of hypnotizability, and how they would comply to a hypnotist who holds higher rank than they. We could expand on this by drawing upon the works of Eliphas Levi, who demonstrates that physical threats can be hypnotism, etc. But we need to begin to wrap things up. Charles Stansfeld Jones, aka Frater Achad, wasn't the only disciple or student of Crowley's who would study hypnosis. In fact, in parts 3, we will look deeper still at Crowley and his circle of students' ties to hypnosis. Let's end with this quote from Aleister Crowley's Little Essays Towards Truth, specifically the essay which bears the title of Trance. Now, all magic is useful to produce trance. For A, it trains the mind in the discipline necessary to yoga. B, it exalts the spirit to the impersonal and divine sublimity, which is the first condition of success. C, it enlarges the scope of the mind, assuring it full mastery of every subtler plane of nature, thus affording it adequate material for ecstatic consummation of the Eucharist of existence. And the essence of the idea of trance is indeed contained in that of magic, which is preeminently the transcendental science and art. Its method is, in one chief sense, love, the very key of trance, and in another, the passing beyond normal conditions. The verbs to transcend, to transmit, to transcribe, and their like are all of cardinal virtue in magic. Hence, love is the law, love under will, is the supreme epitome of magical doctrine and its universal formula. For need any man fear to state boldly that every magical operation soever is only complete when it is characterized, in one sense or another, by the occurrence of trance.
What we found in your room justified all our fears. How long have you been reading these horrid books?
That old black man